Apparently the guys in the booth still need one. So I'll say more about that outline and the lesson schedule, Lord willing, if I have a little bit of time before we end this morning. We're not going to have a book or questions or anything like that I'll be giving out this quarter in here. We'll just be, as I told somebody a minute ago, we don't need no book. We're going to study the Bible. So we're going to focus on the text. I'm really wanting everybody to make sure you read the text that we'll be studying before each class period and give some personal and private study to that at home before coming to class. That'll help you a lot in following along what we're learning when we're together. So I'll talk more about that at the end this morning if we have some time. So glad to have you with us in this study this quarter. Hope we can all make it every class that possibly can and enjoy this good study of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is a very challenging book, and I think most of us recognize that. We'll talk some more about those challenges in a little bit, but it's a book that's got a lot for us, a lot of great information. When I say challenging, not only challenging to understand, but challenging in a good way. That is, it challenges us to be better than we are and to solve problems in a way that God would want us to, and to worship Him in a way that He wants us to, along with a lot of other things. So live holy lives. Those kinds of things are emphasized in 1 Corinthians. So we're excited about the study, and I hope you are too. We'll be talking this morning, just laying some groundwork for studying 1 Corinthians, talking about the church there, its establishment. I thought my thinking here was really two or three things. One is that you're just coming out of, the study of the 3-year cycle, and you've studied through the book of Acts in the last couple of quarters and then looked at a sort of survey of the epistles. And so this would be a really good time to go back and pick out some of the epistles and study them more in depth. So I thought, well, let's pick out an epistle. And 1 Corinthians is one that I thought we hadn't been studied in quite a while here, and I'd like to study it with you. Honestly, I really wanted to study 2 Corinthians because I like that study better. But I figured we have to study 1 Corinthians before we study 2 Corinthians. So maybe in a quarter or two down the road, I'll get to teach 2 Corinthians in here as well. But 1 Corinthians will be a good study. So that's some of my thinking about why I choose to study 1 Corinthians this time. Well, let's talk some about the background of this book and of the church at Corinth. Some of this material, a good bit of this first part of this material, I presented in here when we were going through Acts a couple of quarters ago when I was in here with you then. And so I just want to, we're talking about Acts 18, and I gave you some background to the city of Corinth then, and I'm going to repeat some of that this morning just to review it and get it fresh in your minds. And then we'll talk about the establishment of the church in Corinth, and then we'll look at the writing of this letter and the circumstances of that. So in Paul's day, Corinth was a relatively new city. That's a strange thing to say if you know much about Corinth, but it was relatively a new city of about 400,000 inhabitants, so a very large city for that day and time. The reason that I say it was relatively new is because the city had been destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. It was not rebuilt until about 100 years later by Julius Caesar. And then it had continued to grow and flourish until about the time of the Apostle Paul, when it seemed to reach historically about its zenith, its peak, as far as a city of some note in this area. It was given the status of a Roman colony, which is very significant. It would have a lot of political clout, and the citizens of Corinth would be regarded as Roman citizens, regardless of whatever background they had. So that was very significant. The population of Corinth, and this comes into play when we study the book, the population of Corinth included people of many nationalities and cultures. Jews were present in sufficient numbers to have a synagogue. We read that in Acts 18 and verse 4 because Paul went into the synagogue. Anybody want to tell me what's the requirement among the Jews? How many Jews did you have to have in a city to have a synagogue? Anybody know that? 10 men. Yeah, 10 men. To have 10 men in there. So you say, well, that doesn't mean necessarily very much. You had 10 men in Corinth that were Jews. But really, when you look at Acts 18, which we'll do in a minute, it's obvious that there were quite a few more than that in the synagogue in Corinth. I think that's pretty obvious when you study that story. So you're talking about a city that was a sort of a glittering city of its time. It was a city that was a trade city, sort of at a crossroads as far as trade goes. It was located on the southern end of this isthmus that joins mainland Greece and the Peloponnesus. This area is known as the Peloponnesus. You've probably heard that term over the years, and this is mainland Greece. And so this is called an isthmus, a little land bridge that connects two main areas of land. So you had this here. You had Olympic type games that were held here, known as the Isthmian Games, and they were almost as big as the Olympics at times. And when Paul writes in the letters to the Corinthians about those games, he was very familiar with that because that was a big deal in Corinth. So that's part of the background culture and area of this city. You see Cenchrea, which is mentioned in the scriptures. It's circled there. It's one of the port cities. We'll be talking about that more in a minute. That facilitated the trade that went on in Corinth. In New Testament times, as we've already mentioned, Corinth was a chief city of the region and a capital of this Roman province that's known as Achaia in this day and time. So here you have a broader view of all of that. Corinth commanded trade routes throughout the Mediterranean, and the reason for that is, again, because of this location. Ships from all countries around the Mediterranean would dock in her harbors. Corinth had two harbors. One, the one to the Cenchrea side, that's called the Saronic Gulf, and it flows into the Aegean Sea. The other one is known as the Gulf of Corinth, where Lycaeum is. That's the other port city, port of Corinth, if you will. And that goes into the Adriatic. So you have these two major seas of the Mediterranean, the Adriatic and the Aegean. And Corinth has access to both, which is really, really unique. And it made it a big trade center. Besides all of that, you had a slipway, or a diolkos, as it's called in Greek, which is basically a land bridge that they would move big ships up onto and pull them across this land bridge from one of the Gulf of Corinth to the Saronic Gulf. And so you had this land bridge. Whoops, that was too fast. This land bridge right here from Lycaeum to Corinth, or to Cenchrea. And all of that, I give you all of that background just to say this is a really busy place. There are a lot of people coming through here from all over the known world. These ships coming through, the trade, the people that would come passing through, and then the people that would come and become familiar with Corinth and stay. And so you see why it grew to this city of 400,000 people. That's a huge city in that day and time. It is interesting to me, as I hope it would be to you, that the two places we know that Paul stayed for a significant period of time, the two cities are Corinth and what other city? Ephesus. Okay, he stayed at Corinth for over a year and a half and Ephesus for over 2. And the significance of that in both cases is that he could stay in one place and people from all over the world would come to him. And so about his stay in Ephesus, it's said in the book of Acts that all Asia heard the gospel because Paul was in Ephesus. And the way that happened was all of Asia would come through Ephesus just about. And so when he was preaching in Ephesus, he was getting the word out to a lot of other places. That's true in Corinth as well. It's such a transient area, so many people. If you could get a sound church going in Corinth and preach the gospel in Corinth, you'd be reaching out to lots and lots of folks really all over that region, all over the world. And it's interesting that the two places he stayed the longest were cities, the two main trade cities, probably in the whole Roman Empire, would be Corinth and Ephesus. And those are the two that he stayed in for the longest period. So you see Corinth, you see its connection to Athens. He came to Corinth from Athens. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So let's talk about some of the geographic and cultural background of Corinth. Corinth is not really famous for philosophers as Athens was. It was really just known for its industry, its trade, and also for the pursuit of immoral vices. Now, that last statement could be said about most of the Greek cities that had been Greek city-states. There was a lot of worldliness, a lot of paganism, a lot of immorality and vice. Even by our standards today, they were extremely worldly people. But in Corinth, that paganism and worldliness and hedonism, it really reached sort of the peak pitch. It was worse in Corinth than anywhere else. And so even among Greek people who were used to paganism, even among those kinds of people, Corinth had this reputation. I mean, you know, it's one thing to be the Las Vegas of the United States, but it's another thing to be the Las Vegas of Greece. And that's kind of what Corinth was. It was the Las Vegas of Greece. I mean, that's just as low as you can go as far as morality is concerned. So a few quotes here, and I shared these with you when I was in here a couple of quarters ago. But to be a Corinthian, if you called somebody a Corinthian, you were saying that you're like a playboy, you know, or we might say today, or something like that. It would refer to somebody who spent time with harlots. As probably most of us are aware, this is mentioned a lot when we study Corinth and the book of 1 Corinthians. There was a temple to the goddess Venus, or Aphrodite, depending on whether you're Greek or Roman, existed in the old city. Now remember, the old city had been destroyed. The temple was still there, but this practice may or may not have been going on during Paul's day. But in the old city, history tells us there was this temple on top of the Acrocorinth in which 1,000 female slaves served as priestesses and committed ritual fornication with those who came to worship this goddess of love and fertility. I'll just say this. If you study the pagan idols of not only Greece, but many of these cultures going way back into the Old Testament, a lot of the goddesses were fertility goddesses. Not just fertility in the sense of having children, which was a big thing back then, of course, but also fertility in the sense of a fertile land, a fertile economy, and all of that sort of thing. So the idea of this fertility goddess who blesses you with children, who gives you prosperity in your land and your crops and all of that sort of thing, that of course had a great appeal to ancient people. And so if you had a goddess who was like this in the pantheon of gods or goddesses of whatever country it was pretty common for ritual fornication. In other words, people would go in and have sexual relations with a priestess or something like that as part of their worship, quote unquote. Well, that's exactly what happened here, but it was not really all that uncommon. You say, well, that's really strange to us, but it wasn't uncommon for that kind of thing to go on among other pagans going way back centuries. And you see traces of that in the Old Testament. If you just kind of look a little bit between the lines, I think that's there in the Old Testament as well. Bobby Graham said, I like this quote about Corinth. He said, what culture was to Athens, vice and corruption were to Corinth. And I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Well, this is the culture in which this church at Corinth was planted. A lot of the Corinthians came right out of this culture, this very hedonistic, paganistic, idolatrous, worldly culture. And in fact, it's just said, Paul states in this letter in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, that some of these people in the church had previously been idolaters and fornicators and homosexuals and thieves and drunkards. So while some of the original group that became Christians were Jews, obviously. Many were not. And a lot of the church's problems, as we're going to read in 1 Corinthians as we go through the book, a lot of the problems that the church had stemmed from people bringing the worldliness of the world in Corinth, the Corinthian world, into the church with them, and still not repenting, not ridding themselves, not being holy, not being separate from their culture. And in that way, may I say, that 1 Corinthians is a book that's much needed for us today. We live in a very secular, somewhat pagan culture now, where more and more a lot of the things that were commonplace in Corinth are becoming commonplace among us. 4 or 5 decades ago, dealing with things like homosexuality and the rampant sexual immorality, children out of wedlock, so on and so forth, that wasn't that big a deal 50 years ago. But it's all around us now. And we have to deal with that reality, and 1 Corinthians will help us deal with that reality and do so in a constructive way. All right. Talk for a few minutes about Paul's experience in Corinth and the planning of the church there. I invite you to open your Bibles to Acts 18. So Paul had spent some time in Athens, made that famous speech on Mars Hill in Athens. He is, without his traveling companions of the world at that time, going forward is really significant from this point forward. Paul's association with Aquila and Priscilla continues for many years, and one would think to the time of their deaths, either Aquila and Priscilla's or Paul's. In Acts 18 and verse 18, when he leaves Corinth, he takes leave of the brethren there and he sails for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila are with him. And you might remember when he gets over to Ephesus, he just passes briefly through Ephesus, but he leaves Aquila and Priscilla there. And so it's because that they're left there that Apollos has somebody to correct him when he goes and makes some wrong statements that need correcting in Ephesus in Acts 19. So I think that's an interesting part of this story. Later on, go back a little bit, in Romans 16 and verse 3, greetings are sent to Priscilla and Aquila. So at that point, they've wound up back in Rome. Paul's probably writing that from Corinth. In 1 Corinthians 16, when he writes back to Corinth in this letter, Aquila and Priscilla are with him. Paul at that time is in Ephesus, and so he's writing with Aquila and Priscilla, and they greet the church that is there. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 19, and 2 Timothy is the last letter that we have of the Apostle Paul, written not too long before his death. He probably was released after he wrote 2 Timothy, but soon imprisoned again and put to death. But the last letter that we have from the Apostle Paul, and still he's sending greetings to Priscilla and Aquila. So this relationship goes on for many years and is a profitable one in the Lord's kingdom. It's an important one. Now, Paul is, at this point, almost through with his second journey, as we call it. And so he's come to Athens, and he goes from there to Corinth. And it's here at this time that the church in Corinth is planted. Paul will reason in the synagogue as we get back in Acts 18. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And so Paul presses now in the synagogue the concept that Jesus is the Christ. And as is the case in many places where Paul went, it's the rejection by the Jews, the rejection of Christ and the rejection of the gospel by the Jews that causes Paul to turn then to take the gospel to the Gentiles. The Jews got it first, got first opportunity. And then when some of them began to reject it, his pattern would be, well, I'm going to turn and take it to the Gentiles because you, as he told some in Antioch of Pisidia, judge yourselves unworthy. So this is what he does. You're turning from people who understand Old Testament law, who are probably, even in a city like this, very, very moral people. Jews tended to, in these places where there were synagogues, they sort of separated themselves from the local community. They were a community to themselves, and they tended to really strive to keep, at least parts of the Old Testament law. They were influenced by Greek culture, these Hellenistic Jews, but they certainly weren't totally involved in Greek culture. But now, it's at this point, and I guess my thing I want to emphasize is, how did all of these Gentiles, these pagans, how did they ever have the opportunity to even become Christians? Well, it's because the Jews rejected the gospel. And so Paul turns then to the Gentiles, and he goes full force into evangelizing people who were these fornicators and idolaters and homosexuals and all of these things that we've already mentioned. And apparently, well, not just apparently, truly, as we'll see in Acts 18 in a minute, many of them believed and were baptized. So you have a thriving church that comes out of this synagogue and then out of the culture of Corinth. You see in Acts 18 and verse 8. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. So you have a Jew becoming a Christian, and then you have many Corinthians, and I take that to be maybe the Gentiles to whom Paul had turned. In talking with people about 1 Corinthians chapter 1 that we'll study next class period, Paul makes a statement there in verse 14. He says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, lest anyone should say that I had baptized in my own name. In verse 17 he said, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. So there are those who want to downplay the importance of baptism, and this is one of the passages that is sometimes used to say, look, Paul didn't even baptize, a lot of people in Corinth. But that's not to say that a lot of people weren't baptized in response to the gospel. In fact, as we just read in Acts 18 and verse 8, many Corinthians were baptized. And so Paul's not downplaying the importance of baptism, but anybody can baptize. Not anybody could preach the gospel to the Corinthians for the first time, because Paul was the one that had that information. So, his preaching of the gospel was the big thing. Anybody could have baptized. And so that's, I think, a sort of a red herring that folks who don't really want to believe in baptism throw up sometimes. That doesn't really have any merit to it. In Acts 18 again, and then in verse 9, although there's been an uproar there and the people in the synagogue got upset with Paul and all of that, the Lord spoke to Paul by night in a vision and said, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. That is an amazing bit of encouragement from the Lord. I mean, you think about it. You're in a largely pagan city of 400,000 people. You've just been more or less kicked out of the synagogue. You've got people who are believing your message, but still you can tell there's going to be some difficulties here. So the Jews have already rejected you. And what you've got left is this city full of idolaters and pagans. And yet God says, I've got many people in this city. And I don't know if the Lord meant who have already turned, and many Corinthians already had been baptized, or people that he knew would accept the gospel once they were presented with it. But he tells Paul to go on and preach. That's encouraging to me, isn't it to you? To think about even this world that's just so filled with worldliness has people in it who will accept the gospel and who want to hear the gospel. And that's the kind of encouragement that Paul was given on this occasion. So he goes on and he continues to preach. As the story continues, though, Paul continues there, it says, 1 year and 6 months. So 1.5 years, at least he's there. But the Jews rise up and start to cause some problems. It says, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." And then when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters." And he drove them from the judgment seat. And all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. So the Jews rise up against Paul, and they take him to this proconsul by the name of Gallio. And Gallio refuses to hear their complaint because it's not really a matter of Roman law. It has to do with Jewish law that they're concerned about. And he basically tells them to take care of it themselves. Sosthenes is the ruler of the synagogue, and he's beaten. And the beating may have been carried out by Greeks who are trying to basically do something here to get Gallio to inject himself into this situation and cause trouble for both the Jews and for the Apostle Paul. This is Gallio's judgment seat right here. It's a picture of the ruins of it. This is one of those archaeological sites that were 100% certain where it was. And this would be the place in the marketplace or the agora of Corinth where Gallio would have been sitting to make his judgments. It's known as a bema or judgment seat. It's among some of the excavations that have been carried on at Corinth. And you see it right here. The bema or judgment seat is situated in the agora, served as a platform on which Roman officials stood while making public appearances. Gallio would have been right at this spot when these events occurred in Acts 18. Gallio is a person that is known outside of the Scriptures, and this becomes very significant for us. Let me spend just a minute explaining why and how. His name appears on an inscription. It's right there in Greek, Gallio. That was found in Delphi. Now, Delphi is just across the isthmus from Corinth. It was a city of the near region. Of course, Corinth is the capital city of this region. Gallio had been instructed to sort of repopulate Delphi. Delphi is this ancient Greek city that goes way back hundreds of years, even before this time. And the Romans wanted it to be repopulated and sort of become, a thriving city again. So Gallio had been sort of ordered to get some special people, some prominent folks to move to Delphi and get things going there again, so to speak. So this plaque was found in Delphi, and it sort of commemorates Gallio doing this. And from what we can read on the plaque, we understand that the date of this particular inscription was 52 AD, and that Gallio had done what he was told to do the year before, which means that he was the ruler there in Corinth in 51 AD. Now that's really significant when it comes to trying to date the activities of Paul. It's one of these, there are 2 or 3 places where we know absolutely what date it was, what year it was. And this is one of those places. Gallio was only proconsul in Corinth for a short period of time. We know that that included 51 AD. So we've got Paul in Corinth in 51 AD. And that really helps us going backwards and forwards, knowing the exact time frames of where he was where, when he was where. So that's helpful to us. And so here's that explanation of the Gallio inscription. The inscription dates between April and July AD 52, and Gallio had done what he was told to do that previous year. Again, it's critical to understanding the chronology of this time period. So that's what I want to talk about next, just real briefly. The chronology of the writing of 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 16 verse 8, Paul indicates that he wrote the letter while he's in Ephesus, which we've already mentioned. Aquila and Priscilla are with him as well. So Paul worked in Corinth for 18 months during his second journey. Later on, he stayed in Ephesus for 2 years and 3 months on his third journey. You see that in Acts 19. 1 Corinthians was then certainly written around 55 AD, give or take a year one way or the other. We're not sure how long some of his travels took, but we are sure how long he stayed in Corinth and how long he stayed in Ephesus. So that gives us a real good, way of determining. And that also helps us determine, sometimes people want to know, well, how do you know what year, say, a certain epistle was written? Well, we know, for instance, that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians from Corinth. He mentions that when he writes to the Thessalonians. So we know when he was in Corinth, 51 AD. So we know when he wrote to the Thessalonians. And so those dates of the epistles, all of that sort of centers around, not all of it, but a good bit of dating the epistles kind of centers around when Gallio was proconsul, because we know that. So that's some sort of background information here. Well, I want you to think about, if you just think about 1 Corinthians, what you know about it already, and I know many of you know a lot about 1 Corinthians already. What's it all about? Why is it written? Well, it addresses problems in a local church, Corinth, right? That's the first thing I think about when I think about Corinth. You got all these problems. Here's a church with a bunch of problems. And Paul's writing to address those problems. And he's trying to restore the church at Corinth to its foundation, which is Jesus Christ and not the ways of men. He wants to counter worldly wisdom with godly wisdom. He's trying to correct and solve some of the contentions in the church. There was a lot of division and divisiveness over a number of different things. People from the household of Chloe had reported to Paul about some of this, and so he wants to answer some of those questions and bring about unity in the church in Corinth. And then he's going to address some questions that the Corinthians must have had. Maybe they wrote him a letter asking him some questions. That seems to be likely, but he'll talk about some of that. And in fact, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1, that seems to be exactly the case when in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 11, he mentioned mentions the things that were reported by the house of Chloe. And in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 1, he says, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me. So now the Corinthians had written some things to him that they wanted answered as well. So that's really the two big divisions of the book that we'll see in a minute. I'll just say this about the study of Corinthians. Corinthians was written to a church that had a lot of problems. They were fussing and fighting about a lot of things. There were divisions there. There were problems in their worship. There are a lot of Christians today, a lot of us kind of don't like to study 1 Corinthians. And the problem is that when we study 1 Corinthians, sometimes we develop some of the same problems that Corinthians was designed to solve. I find that to be ironic. That of all of the books of the New Testament, maybe the one that we have most disagreements about and get divisive over is the book of 1 Corinthians. Have y'all ever thought about that? That's a little bit ironic. That's certainly not Paul's intention. The book is designed to solve problems, not create them, to create unity, not disunity, to help us be holier and closer together. And so I don't want us to fear studying 1 Corinthians. I want us to learn the lessons from 1 Corinthians and hope that we can do that in this quarter. Well, I've given you an outline, and now back to that you have hopefully in your hand. Sort of an outline of the book, just real quick. We'll start off with a salutation and some thanksgiving in the first 9 verses. And then I divide the book of 1 Corinthians up into 2 large main sections. And the first one deals with reported problems, reported from the house of Chloe mainly, I think. And that covers chapter 1 and verse 10 through chapter 6 and verse 20. And so you have that there in your outline. And then the second large section deals with questions and concerns from Corinth, and those are dealt with: marriage problems, eating things sacrificed to idols, rights and responsibilities of preachers, idolatry, eating the Lord's Supper, headship as respect to praying and prophesying, spiritual gifts, that's a big topic, the gospel of the resurrection. All of those things I think are questions and issues that Corinth had raised that they wanted Paul to answer, and so he addresses all of those. So that's the basic outline. What I'd like for you to do this quarter is to, as we go through, just try to memorize that outline. Now, I've given you one sheet of paper, and I want you to learn what's on that one sheet of paper. Okay, and the outline, basically, I found that outlines are extremely helpful. If I can get sort of an outline in my head of a book and understand its contents that way, and that I understand much better the flow of it and the arguments that are made in it, and so, sort of how the logic flows through the book. And so think about trying to learn that outline, or maybe make an outline of your own that makes sense to you to help you follow the flow of the book. The other thing you have on the back of that sheet then is we're just going to call this your weekly readings or your bi-weekly readings. And what I want you to do is spend time before each class period. It won't take you 5 minutes to read the section of Scripture that we're going to be studying, but spend more than 5 minutes. Maybe read it multiple times. Maybe spend a little time outlining it. Maybe if you had some good commentaries at home, open them up and see what they have to say. But spend some time looking at that section of Scripture, and that'll prepare your mind much better for studying together, rather than just coming to class cold and not even knowing, what we're going to be looking at. Just take a few minutes through the week before we come to class. And what I'm thinking about doing is, I know not everybody has email. You wouldn't necessarily need to have email, but I'm thinking about sending out an email a couple of days before each class period to everybody that's on the Eastsiders list that just has the reading for the next class period. So you'll be able to, if you forgot or whatever, that'll be a good reminder for you. Come in your email, and I'll just include the text to be read, and you can prepare your mind then to study with us in that way. Y'all have questions or anything? Encourage you to just stick that sheet of paper in your Bible or in your Bible holder so you have it with you through the quarter, and again, reference it at home through the week. Looking forward to studying with you. We'll start in 1 Corinthians 1. Your first reading is chapter 1, verses 1 through 17 for our next Sunday morning. Wednesday night I'll be singing. All right. Thank you all.